Welcome to this very special episode dedicated to the space program.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Again, welcome to this very special episode of our podcast where we'll be exploring the space program now, in the future, and a little bit of the history. And Tyler has our first segment.
Yes, Richmond, thank you. First, let's have a look at our data download. The space program is perhaps the most famous, even infamous, branches of the federal government. Some people you come across are familiar with the Mercury and Gemini programs, but everyone is familiar with the Apollo missions, the missions to land on the moon. Many would agree that this was a time of great national pride and advancement in technology. Following the end of the Apollo missions, the US set out to design a reusable space vehicle we know and love called the Space Shuttle.
This has served, along with many other launch vehicles, such as the Delta series of rockets, to send satellites into orbit. It has also served as the space crane in the construction of the International Space Station, though it is planned that all the space shuttles will be decommissioned by the end of next year. So, to maintain our presence on the International Space Station, we will be launching from Russia in the Soyuz capsule. The Constellation program, which was intended to replace the space shuttle and return us to the moon, was recently cancelled. This leaves the US in a rather perplexing position where there is no program under development by NASA to maintain our position in space. This leaves the US at the mercy of a few companies who are attempting to get into space themselves.
Up next, we have Nick Bradford, a political science major, and his analysis of the space program.
Well, I'd say this new direction with the space program is definitely politically oriented. It's an agenda. And if you look at the two parties right now, what the Obama administration is doing is it's actually seceding this entire history of the space program, and they're kind of throwing all that progress away or putting it on hold just because they feel that the economy needs stability or these social programs need rethinking. It's kind of this was kind of the similar arguments they made during the 60s and 70s and 80s when they also wanted to cut the space program. They wanted to have boots on the ground, thinking on the mud and the dirt down here on Earth instead of dreaming about stars and whatnot, and what the practical use was for that. And that's always kind of been a political argument for keeping the space program and whatnot. But I mean, there's a lot of things you need to consider with the space program. I mean, it's a national competitive issue in the international arena for both security, technology, and economic reasons. I think you have to consider government as an agent for infrastructure, and using the space program and NASA as an infrastructure tool is a kind of a clear fundamental duty, I think, that you could see the United States using in the next century. You also have to look at this as a move that's politically motivated as against the military-industrial complex. NASA's always been tied into that kind of system by providing technological spin-offs for the aerospace and defense industry, and then of course links in with the military. So things to consider here is what is the Obama administration actually getting out of cutting the space program or limiting it? Well, one, they're gaining more traction with this idea of we need to consolidate the budget. They're trying to act like fiscal conservatives, but the real fiscal conservatives, Republicans and conservatives in the United States today, actually approve of defense spending and aerospace technology like NASA. So there's this ironic conflict that Democrats and liberals will actually say, we're fiscal conservatives, we're taking money out of these wasteful programs that aren't going anywhere, and we're putting them back into social programs. Now that's their prerogative, but you can see how that's motivated as a tool to kind of realign the propaganda and the agenda there. Things to consider that way are that by taking this geocentric view. I mean, it's kind of funny. You could go back to the Galileo kind of debates and that argument. This is kind of a geocentric view. We want to stay here, think about this, put these programs on hold. Now, is that gonna pay off? That's a policy question you're gonna have to ask yourself. Now, kind of moving on to this idea of international competition. I mean, you can see that the Russian program, the European programs, they're probably not on par with us yet at all. But China is certainly moving up. I mean, there's a lot of China fear out there, and you can go one way or the other with it. But is it valid? And just looking at the space program, I mean, go back to the Cold War. I mean, that's what motivated NASA as a program. Everybody remembers the famous speech that JFK gave about putting a man on the moon, and how that was a Cold War oriented goal. It was the space program has and always will be an issue of sovereignty as far as politics go. I mean, we're looking at, the moon is considered non-national, Antarctica is considered non-national. When you consider new frontiers, there's always a sovereignty issue associated with states and their jurisdiction in this area. So that's going to be a real issue when you start looking at states moving outside the Earth's atmosphere and the geocentric view. In this case, if you look at it, the NASA program has this tool, this policy vector for getting there as a security issue, brings out that conflict between states. So China's getting is ahead of us both in their normal infrastructure here on Earth, their high-speed trains, mass transit. They're moving far ahead of us that way, and that's already been exceeded by and admitted by the current U.S. administration. And so it's ironic that the Obama administration actually wants to promote mass transit and high-speed infrastructure mass transit here on Earth, but they're not considering what the Chinese are also doing by going into space and promoting that program. It's an issue of that competition. So going back to this idea of the Cold War NASA institution, when you looked at, there were a lot of times that people wanted to go back or limit the space program once it got going. If you remember from the Apollo missions, the later Apollo missions, especially consider Apollo 13, they were slotting TV time for game shows and other talk shows instead of the actual viewing of the footage from the mission, the live footage. So that social motivation, these prioritizations were changing, because at this time in the late 60s, we were in a détente, what's called the détente with the Soviet Union, and the détente was basically that we kind of resolved issues after the 62 the October Cuban Missile Crisis. And so once that had been kind of resolved and we'd thought out the Cold War a little bit, we didn't need NASA so much, or these programs so much, for this idea of competition. But so an issue to look at there is people forgot about the space program because they didn't think it was useful as a tool for a national agenda. They were more considered about domestic issues, basically. And that changed real quickly again in the 70s and the 80s when hardliners came back from the Soviet Union, and they wanted to, and in the US as well, when they wanted to push the Cold War as more of a military political engagement. And so that reversed things again. So these things go up and down. And we saw kind of a golden age in the 90s, late 90s, with the whole Mars program. And so that shows you this up and down flow. And currently you have to admit that the recession is going to, everybody looking at the space program has to realize that the recession is going to have a huge impact on cutting programs across the board. We all have to admit that.